In 1981, three identical triplets vanished without a trace from their quiet California neighborhood, disappearing while playing outside their family home. 6-year-old Sarah, Sophie, and Stella Harper were there one moment, gone the next. For 15 years, investigators found nothing. No clues, no answers, no hope. The case went cold and the community moved on. But what their mother Margaret discovered would shatter everything she thought she knew about that day. The truth was more disturbing and closer to home than anyone had imagined. Before we dive into today's vanished story, drop a comment letting us know where you're watching from, and make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories for more mysterious disappearance cases. The Saturday morning farmers market in downtown Watsonville buzzed with the familiar rhythm of small-town commerce. Margaret Harper, now 52 with silver threading through her once dark hair, moved slowly between the vendor stalls, her weathered hands examining tomatoes with the critical eye of someone who had spent decades gardening. "These look good," John said, appearing beside her with a canvas bag already heavy with produce. At 55, he had developed the patient demeanor of a man who had learned to live with perpetual grief, though his eyes still held shadows that hadn't been there before 1981. Margaret nodded absently, her attention caught by a colorful display across the walkway. "Strawberry Sisters Farm," read the hand-painted sign above a table laden with perfect red strawberries arranged in neat wooden baskets. The berries gleamed like jewels in the morning sunlight. "Oh, look at those strawberries," Margaret murmured, drawn toward the stand despite herself. Even after 15 years, she couldn't pass a strawberry display without thinking of that morning, of the girls' laughter echoing from the backyard while John worked in their patch. As they approached, Margaret noticed a young woman arranging berries with practiced efficiency. She appeared to be in her early 20s, with strawberry blonde hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. Her movements were quick and precise as she restocked the display. "These are beautiful," Margaret said, stopping at the edge of the table. "Are they grown locally?" The young woman looked up with a bright smile. "Yes, ma'am. We grow them organically about 30 miles east of town. My sisters and I run the farm together." Margaret felt something flutter in her chest at the word sisters, but she pushed the feeling aside. The girl was probably referring to biological sisters or close friends. Still, something about her face seemed familiar in a way that made Margaret's breath catch. "3 of you?" John asked casually, though Margaret noticed his tone had become more attentive. "That's right," the girl replied, wiping her hands on her apron. "We've been farming together since we were kids, started as a hobby and just kept growing." She gestured toward the other end of the market. "My sisters are over there talking to the organic certification folks about expanding our operation." Margaret's eyes followed her gesture, and she saw 2 other young women engaged in animated conversation with an older man in a county agriculture jacket. Even from a distance, the resemblance between the 3 was striking. They moved with similar gestures, stood with identical posture. "What are your names?" Margaret asked, trying to keep her voice casual despite the hammering of her heart. "I'm Sarah," the girl replied. "My sisters are Sophie and Stella." The basket of strawberries slipped from Margaret's suddenly nerveless fingers, scattering fruit across the asphalt. John caught her elbow as she swayed slightly, his own face having gone pale. "I'm sorry," Margaret gasped, bending to gather the fallen berries. "I'm so clumsy. How much do I owe you for these?" "Don't worry about it," Sarah said kindly, coming around the table to help collect the fruit. "Happens all the time at markets. The baskets can be slippery." As Sarah knelt beside her, Margaret found herself staring at the girl's profile. The slope of her nose, the shape of her ear, the way she tucked her hair behind it, all achingly familiar. But this girl was 21, not 6. She was tall and lean, where Margaret remembered round cheeks and gap-toothed grins. "Are you all right, honey?" John asked quietly, his hand steady on her back. "I'm fine," Margaret managed, accepting Sarah's help to stand. "Just felt a little dizzy for a moment." Sarah studied her with concern. "Would you like some water?" "I have a bottle in our cooler." "That's very kind, but I'm fine now," Margaret replied, though her hands were still trembling. "Your strawberries really are beautiful. Where did you say your farm was located?" "About 30 miles east, up in the foothills," Sarah replied. "We're pretty remote, which helps keep the berries organic and pest-free. Our father taught us everything about sustainable farming." "Your father?" John asked carefully. "Robert Greenfield," Sarah said with obvious affection in her voice. "He adopted us when we were little and taught us to love the land. Best dad 3 girls could ask for." Margaret felt the world tilt slightly. Robert Greenfield. The name surfaced from memories she had tried to bury, connected to those terrible months after the disappearance when they had answered countless questions and followed endless false leads. "Mr. Greenfield," Margaret repeated slowly. "Was he a teacher?" "He was, actually," Sarah confirmed, her smile brightening. "Elementary school science teacher for years before he decided farming was his true calling." "How did you know?" Before Margaret could answer, the other 2 sisters approached the stand. Up close, the resemblance was even more pronounced. All 3 had the same strawberry blonde hair, the same blue-green eyes, the same delicate bone structure that Margaret remembered tracing with her fingers during bedtime stories 15 years ago. "Sarah, we need to start packing up," one of them said, glancing at her watch. "Dad wants us back by noon to help with the new irrigation system." "Of course," Sarah replied. "Sophie, Stella, these nice folks were just admiring our berries." Margaret's knees nearly buckled. Sophie and Stella turned toward them with polite smiles, and Margaret saw her daughters' faces reflected in theirs, aged and changed, but unmistakably familiar. Sophie had always been the most serious of the 3, and this Sophie carried herself with the same thoughtful composure. Stella, the youngest by 11 minutes, still had that slight tilt to her head when she listened, just as she had as a child. "We should go," John said quietly, taking Margaret's arm. His voice was strained, controlled. "Wait," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper. She stared at the 3 young women, memorizing their faces. Do any of you ever have dreams about a different place? A different family?" The 3 sisters exchanged glances. Something flickered across their faces. Confusion, perhaps, or a shadow of something deeper. "That's an odd question," Sophie said carefully. "Sometimes," Stella admitted softly, "sometimes I dream about a woman with dark hair who used to sing to us. But they're just dreams." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. She had sung to them every night, lullabies and folk songs in her clear alto voice that John had loved to listen to from the doorway. "Margaret," John said urgently, "we need to go. Now." This time she let him lead her away, walking unsteadily between the market stalls while her mind reeled. Behind them she could hear the sisters talking in low voices, their conversation too distant to make out, but charged with an undercurrent of tension. "Did you see?" Margaret whispered when they reached their car. "Did you see their faces, John? The way they moved?" "I saw," John replied grimly, starting the engine with hands that shook slightly. "But Margaret, we can't jump to conclusions. 15 years is a long time. We could be seeing what we want to see." "Robert Greenfield," Margaret said, staring out the windshield. "John, I remember that name from the investigation. Don't you remember? Detective Carson mentioned him." John was quiet for a long moment as he navigated out of the parking lot. "I remember a lot of names from those days," he said finally. "Most of them led nowhere." "But he was their science teacher," Margaret insisted. "He knew them, he knew us. And now he has 3 daughters who look exactly like our girls and have the same names." "Margaret?" John's voice carried a warning. "We've been down this road before. How many times have we thought we saw them? How many false hopes have we chased?" Margaret fell silent, remembering the parade of phone calls over the years, the sightings that led to other families' children, the photographs that looked promising until seen up close. Each disappointment had carved another line in her face, another shadow in John's eyes. But this felt different. Those girls hadn't just resembled her daughters. They had moved like them, smiled like them. And the names... "I want to find out where this farm is," she said quietly. "Margaret..." "Just to look," she interrupted. "Just to see. If I'm wrong, then I'm wrong. But John, what if I'm not?" That evening, Margaret sat at their kitchen table with the local phone book spread open, running her finger down the listings. John watched from the doorway, coffee mug in hand, his expression a mixture of concern and resignation. "There's no Robert Greenfield in the residential listings," Margaret said, flipping to the business section. "But there's a Greenfield Organic Farms with a P.O. box." "Of course there's no street address," John said, settling into the chair across from her. "If someone wanted to hide 3 kidnapped children, they wouldn't exactly advertise their location." Margaret looked up sharply. "So you do think it's possible?" John sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "I think we've learned not to trust our first instincts when it comes to this, but I also think we can't ignore what we saw today." "The way Stella tilted her head when she listened," Margaret continued, as if he hadn't spoken. "Sophie's serious expression when she was thinking. And Sarah, God, John, she had that same little wrinkle between her eyebrows that she used to get when she was concentrating." "They could be anyone, Margaret. 15 years changes people." "Not everything," Margaret insisted. "Not the way you hold your shoulders or tilt your head, not the shape of your hands or the sound of your laugh." John studied his wife's face, noting the flush of excitement that had replaced the gray exhaustion she'd worn for so many years. "What do you want to do?" "I want to find that farm," Margaret said immediately. "I want to see where they live, how they live. I want to know who Robert Greenfield really is." "And then what?" "If it really is them, if they're alive and well and think he's their father, what then? Do we tear apart their lives with the truth?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment. "They deserve to know who they really are," she said finally. "We deserve to know what happened to our daughters." The next morning, Margaret was waiting at the Watsonville Public Library when it opened. The librarian, a woman Margaret's age with kind eyes, helped her access the newspaper archives on microfilm. "I'm researching local farming operations," Margaret explained, which was technically true. "Particularly organic farms that started in the mid-1980s. It took 2 hours of scrolling through grainy newspaper pages, but she finally found it, a small article from 1982 titled "Local Teacher Turns to Farming." The accompanying photograph showed a younger Robert Greenfield standing in front of a modest farmhouse, holding a shovel and grinning at the camera. Margaret recognized him immediately. He had been about 35 when he taught at Watsonville Elementary. A tall man with prematurely gray hair and a gentle manner that had made him popular with both students and parents. The article mentioned his purchase of a 150-acre plot in the coastal foothills, his plans for organic agriculture, and his recent adoption of 3 young sisters who had been orphaned in a tragic accident. "Orphaned in a tragic accident," Margaret whispered, her hands clenching on the microfilm viewer's edge. The paper was dated 6 months after her daughter's disappearance. She printed the article and continued searching. Over the next few years, there were occasional mentions of Greenfield Organic Farms in the agricultural sections, awards for sustainable farming practices, participation in county fairs, grants for innovative irrigation systems. Always, the articles mentioned his 3 adopted daughters who helped run the farm. But there were no photographs of the girls, no mention of their ages or backgrounds, no details about the tragic accident that had supposedly orphaned them. Margaret drove home with the printed articles on the passenger seat, her mind churning. When she walked into the kitchen, she found John sitting at the table with his own stack of papers. "I went to the courthouse," he said without preamble. "Public records search." Margaret sat down across from him. "What did you find?" Robert Greenfield purchased 150 acres of land in March 1982, John said, consulting his notes. Paid cash. Before that, he'd been renting a small apartment in town, living alone. No wife, no children mentioned in any official documents. And the adoption? That's where it gets interesting, John said, his voice grim. There's no record of any adoption proceedings in Santa Cruz County. No record of 3 orphaned sisters, no tragic accident reported in any newspaper from that time period. Margaret stared at him. That's impossible. Adoptions have to be legal, documented. Unless they weren't really adoptions, John said quietly. Unless he just took 3 children and created false identities for them. But they'd need birth certificates, social security numbers, school records. All of which can be forged or obtained illegally if you know the right people, John replied. And a man who could plan and execute the kidnapping of 3 children might well have thought that far ahead. Margaret felt a chill run down her spine. John, if those really are our girls, then we need to be very, very careful, he finished. Because Robert Greenfield has spent 15 years convincing them that he's their father and that we don't exist. Approaching this wrong could destroy them or get them hurt. That afternoon, Margaret found herself drawn back to the farmer's market, even though she knew the Strawberry Sisters wouldn't be there. She wandered between the stalls aimlessly, her mind replaying every moment of yesterday's encounter. "Excuse me," she said to the vegetable vendor in the space next to where the strawberry stand had been. "Do you know the girls who were selling strawberries here yesterday?" The elderly man looked up from arranging his display of carrots. "The Greenfield girls? Sure, I've known them for years. Sweet kids, hard workers." "How long have they been coming to the market?" "Oh, must be 8-9 years now," the man replied. "Started when they were just teenagers, selling from a card table. Their dad's real proud of what they've built." "Their father comes with them sometimes?" "Bob?" "Yeah, he drops by occasionally. Good man, Bob Greenfield, took those girls in when they had nobody and gave them a real home. Not many men would take on 3 children like that." Margaret's hands clenched at her sides. "What happened to their parents?" The vendor shrugged. "Some kind of accident, I think. They don't talk about it much, can't blame them really. Losing your folks when you're that young?" He shook his head sympathetically. "How young were they when it happened?" "Oh, they were just little things. 6 or 7, maybe. Bob's been their dad for pretty much their whole lives, far as they're concerned." Margaret thanked the vendor and walked away on unsteady legs, 6 years old, the same age her daughters had been when they disappeared. That evening, she and John spread everything they had learned across their kitchen table. The newspaper articles, the public records, the timeline of events. The evidence was circumstantial but damning. "We need to see the farm," Margaret said. "We need to see where they live." John studied the map they'd found showing the general location of Greenfield Organic Farms. "It's remote," he said. "Probably 30 minutes from the nearest neighbor. If Greenfield is what we think he is, that isolation would be perfect for keeping 3 children hidden." "Or 3 young women who don't know they're being kept hidden," Margaret added. They sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of their suspicions settling over them like a heavy blanket. "Tomorrow," John said finally. "We'll drive out tomorrow and see what we can see. But Margaret, we have to promise each other, no matter what we find, we don't do anything rash. We observe, we gather information, and then we decide how to proceed." Margaret nodded, though every instinct in her body was screaming at her to get in the car right now, drive to that farm, and demand the truth. 15 years of not knowing had taught her patience, but it had also filled her with a desperate hunger for answers that threatened to consume her completely. The drive into the coastal foothills took them through increasingly sparse countryside, past small ranches and apple orchards clinging to the rolling hills. Margaret watched the landscape change through the passenger window, her stomach tight with anticipation and dread. "According to the map, it should be just ahead," John said, slowing their sedan as they crested a small hill. Below them, A valley opened up like a green bowl, with a cluster of buildings nestled at its heart. Even from a distance, they could see the neat rows of strawberry plants stretching across the lower fields, and several figures moving between the plants. John pulled off onto a dirt turnout that offered a view down into the valley while keeping them partially hidden by a stand of oak trees. He shut off the engine, and they sat in silence, studying the scene below. The main house was a 2-story farmhouse with white clapboard siding and a wraparound porch. A red barn dominated one side of the property, with several smaller outbuildings scattered around it. Gardens and greenhouses occupied the space between the buildings, and beyond that, the strawberry fields stretched nearly to the tree line. "It's beautiful," Margaret admitted reluctantly. "It looks like a perfect place to raise children." Through a pair of binoculars John had brought, they could see 3 young women working in the nearest field, moving methodically through the rows as they tended the plants. Even at this distance, their coordinated movements and similar builds were unmistakable. "There," John said, handing Margaret the binoculars. "The one on the left, is that Sarah?" Margaret adjusted the focus and felt her breath catch. It was definitely Sarah, wearing work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat, but unmistakably the same girl from the farmer's market. She was kneeling beside a plant, examining something with the careful attention that Margaret remembered from her own daughter's childhood fascination with their backyard garden. "She's checking for pests," Margaret murmured, memories flooding back. Sarah always wanted to help with the strawberry patch. She'd spend hours looking for bugs and snails. As they watched, a tall man emerged from the house and walked toward the fields. Even from their distant vantage point, Margaret recognized his deliberate gait and the set of his shoulders. "That's him," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "That's Robert Greenfield." The man approached the 3 young women, and they gathered around him in a loose circle. From their body language, he appeared to be giving them instructions, gesturing toward different sections of the field. The women listened attentively, nodding occasionally, their posture deferential in a way that made Margaret's chest tighten. "They're afraid of him," she said suddenly. "What makes you say that?" Margaret studied the scene through the binoculars. "Look at how they're standing. Look at their body language. That's not how daughters stand with a beloved father. That's how children stand with an authority figure they don't want to disappoint." John took the binoculars and observed for several minutes. "You might be right," he said finally. "Or they might just be respectful. We can't read too much into body language from this distance." They continued watching for another hour, documenting everything they saw. The 3 sisters worked tirelessly, breaking only when Greenfield brought them water. They moved with the efficiency of people accustomed to hard physical labor, but there was no joy in their movements, no casual conversation or laughter. "This is wrong," Margaret said, lowering the binoculars. "John, this whole situation is wrong. Those are our daughters down there, and they're living like indentured servants." "We don't know that," John cautioned. "Many farm families work hard. It doesn't necessarily mean—" "Look at their clothes," Margaret interrupted. "Look at how they dress, how they carry themselves. They're isolated up here, cut off from the outside world except for the farmer's market. It's a perfect way to control someone." As if summoned by her words, Greenfield began walking back toward the house, and the 3 sisters resumed their work. But Margaret noticed something else. One of them, she thought it might be Sophie, glanced toward the road, her gaze sweeping across the hills as if she were looking for something or someone. "We need to get closer," Margaret said. "We need to find a way to talk to them without Greenfield around." "That's exactly what we promised we wouldn't do," John reminded her. "John, what if they want to leave but don't know how? What if they've been brainwashed into thinking they have nowhere to go?" Before John could respond, they saw Greenfield emerge from the house again, this time carrying what appeared to be a rifle. He stood on the porch scanning the hills around the property with obvious suspicion. "He knows someone's watching," John said quietly. "We need to go. Now." They drove away slowly, trying not to raise dust that might give away their position. Margaret's hands were clenched in her lap, her mind racing with everything they had observed. "We have to do something," she said, as they reached the main road. "We can't just leave them there." "We need proof," John replied. "Real proof, not just suspicions and wishful thinking. If we're wrong about this, we could destroy innocent people's lives." "And if we're right?" John was quiet for a long moment. "Then we call the police and pray that 15 years hasn't been too long." That evening, Margaret couldn't concentrate on anything. She wandered through their house, picking up objects and putting them down, starting tasks and abandoning them. In her daughter's old bedroom, which she had never been able to bring herself to change, she sat on one of the small beds and stared at the photos that covered the walls. 3 identical faces smiled back at her from dozens of pictures: birthday parties, Christmas mornings, family vacations. Sarah with her gap-toothed grin, Sophie with her serious expression, Stella with her arms wrapped around the family dog. They had been so young, so trusting, so completely unaware that the world contained people who might hurt them. John found her there an hour later, tears streaming silently down her face. "I keep thinking about that last morning," she said without looking up, "about how I called out to them to stay where I could see them. But I was doing dishes, John. I wasn't really watching. I let them down." "You didn't let anyone down," John said firmly, sitting beside her on the narrow bed. "You were being a normal parent in what should have been a safe neighborhood. This isn't your fault." "I could have prevented it. If I had been more careful, more protective—" "Then he would have found another opportunity," John interrupted. "Margaret, men like Greenfield don't give up easily. If he wanted to take the girls, he would have found a way." Margaret wiped her eyes and looked at him. "You really think it's them, don't you?" John nodded slowly. "I think the evidence is compelling enough that we have to pursue it. But we have to be smart about it. We have to build a case that will hold up in court." "How do we do that?" "We start with DNA," John said. "We find a way to get samples from all 3 of them, and we compare it to the samples the police have on file from us." "How do we get DNA samples without them knowing?" John considered this. The farmer's market, hair from a brush, saliva on a water bottle, something they've touched that might have skin cells. Margaret felt a spark of hope. "They'll be there again next Saturday. We could observe," John corrected, "carefully, subtly, and if an opportunity presents itself to collect evidence, we take it. But we don't approach them directly." "What if they recognize us? What if they remember something?" "Then we deal with that when it happens," John said. "But Margaret, we have to prepare ourselves for the possibility that they won't remember us at all. They were 6 years old. 15 years is a long time." Margaret nodded, though the thought sent a sharp pain through her chest. Her daughters might be alive, might be less than 50 miles away, but they might look at her face and see a complete stranger. Still, she thought, remembering Stella's mention of dreams about a woman who used to sing, some part of them remembered. Some buried part of their consciousness held onto the truth, waiting for the right moment to surface. She just had to find a way to bring that moment about. Saturday morning arrived gray and misty, the marine layer that often blanketed the coast extending inland to shroud the farmer's market in a soft haze. Margaret and John arrived early, positioning themselves at a coffee stand with a clear view of where the Strawberry Sisters had set up their booth the previous week. At 8:30, a battered pickup truck pulled into the market's small parking lot. Margaret's heart jumped as she watched 3 young women climb out of the cab, moving with practiced efficiency to unload baskets and display materials from the truck bed. "That's them," she whispered to John, though she hardly needed to confirm what they both could see clearly. "I see them," John replied, his voice tight with controlled emotion. "Remember, we observe. We don't approach unless they approach us first." They watched as Sarah, Sophie, and Stella set up their strawberry stand, arranging their display with the same careful attention to detail Margaret had observed the previous week. But today, Margaret noticed, there was an additional tension in their movements, a subtle hypervigilance as they glanced frequently toward the market entrance. "They're watching for something," John observed, or someone. Indeed, the three sisters seemed to be taking turns scanning the growing crowd, their attention divided between their customers and some unseen concern. When a middle-aged man in work clothes approached their stand, all three women tensed visibly until he simply purchased berries and moved on. "They're afraid," Margaret said. "John, look at them. They're terrified of something." For 2 hours, Margaret and John maintained their distant observation, noting how the sisters interacted with customers, polite but guarded, efficient but never truly relaxed. They spoke in low voices to each other when they thought no one was listening, and Margaret found herself straining to catch fragments of their conversation. At 10:30, their patience was rewarded. Sarah left the stand, walking toward the market's small restroom facility. Margaret immediately stood to follow. "What are you doing?" John hissed. "This might be our only chance to talk to one of them alone," Margaret replied. "I'm just going to use the restroom. If she's there, maybe we'll have a casual conversation." Before John could protest further, Margaret was walking quickly across the market square. She reached the restroom building just as Sarah was emerging, and for a moment they stood face to face in the morning mist. Up close, Margaret could see the young woman's features even more clearly, the shape of her eyes, the curve of her mouth, the small scar on her chin from a bicycle accident when she was 5. It was all there, aged but unmistakable. "Oh," Sarah said, recognition flickering across her face. "You're the woman from last week, the one who dropped the strawberries." "Yes," Margaret managed, her voice catching slightly. "Margaret Harper. And you're Sarah." "That's right." Sarah's expression was polite but wary. "Is everything all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," Margaret said, though she felt anything but fine. I wanted to tell you how much we enjoyed your strawberries. My husband and I have been growing them for years ourselves." "Really?" Sarah's expression brightened slightly. "It's not easy. The pests alone can drive you crazy." "We've learned to use companion planting," Margaret said, drawing on years of gardening experience. "Basil and strawberries work well together. The basil repels aphids and spider mites." "Dad taught us that too," Sarah said, and Margaret caught the slight hesitation before the word "Dad." "He's very knowledgeable about organic methods." "I'm sure he is," Margaret said carefully. "Has he been farming long?" Sarah's expression shuddered slightly. "Since I was little. Since we were little, I mean. My sisters and I." "You must have grown up on the farm then." "Yes." Sarah glanced back toward the market, where her sisters were visible in the distance. "We should probably get back. Sophie worries when any of us is away too long." "Of course," Margaret said, but she couldn't resist one more question. "Sarah, do you ever think about your life before the farm?" The young woman went very still. "What do you mean?" "I just wondered if you had any memories from when you were very small, before you lived with your father." Sarah's face had gone pale now, and her hands were trembling slightly. "I don't—" "Why are you asking me these questions?" "Because," Margaret said, her voice barely above a whisper, "I think you might remember more than you realize." "I have to go," Sarah said abruptly, stepping back toward the market. "I'm sorry, but I really have to go." She walked quickly away, leaving Margaret standing alone by the restroom building with her heart pounding. She had pushed too hard, revealed too much. But she had also seen something in Sarah's eyes, a flicker of recognition, a moment of confusion that suggested the young woman's carefully constructed world might not be as solid as it appeared. When Margaret returned to John, he took one look at her face and immediately led her away from the coffee stand. "What happened?" he asked, as soon as they were out of earshot. "I talked to her," Margaret said, still shaking. "John, it's her. I know it's her. She has the scar on her chin from when she fell off her bike. She remembers the companion planting techniques we taught her, and when I asked about her memories from before the farm—" Margaret trailed off, remembering the fear that had flashed across Sarah's face. "She got scared," John concluded. Terrified, Margaret confirmed, like she was forbidden to think about those things, let alone talk about them. They were walking toward their car when John grabbed Margaret's arm, pulling her behind a vendor truck. "Don't look," he said quietly, "but the pickup truck is leaving." Margaret couldn't help but glance toward the parking lot, where she saw the Strawberry Sisters hastily loading their remaining berries and equipment. Even from a distance, their movements appeared frantic, almost panicked. "They're running," Margaret said. "John, they're running because I spooked her." "Or because someone told them to leave," John replied grimly. "Look." A second vehicle was pulling out of the parking lot behind the pickup truck, a newer sedan with tinted windows that had been parked at the far edge of the lot. As it passed their hiding spot, Margaret caught a glimpse of the driver, Robert Greenfield, his face set in hard lines as he followed his daughters out of town. He was watching them, Margaret realized. He was here the whole time, making sure they didn't talk to anyone. "And now he knows that someone is asking questions," John said. "Margaret, we may have just put those girls in serious danger." The implications of what they had just witnessed settled over them like a cold fog. If the three young women were indeed their kidnapped daughters, then their captivity was even more complete than Margaret had imagined. They weren't just isolated on a remote farm. They were under constant surveillance, their every interaction monitored and controlled. "We have to call the police," Margaret said. "We can't handle this alone anymore." John nodded, pulling out his cell phone. "But first we follow them, at a distance. If Greenfield is spooked enough to run, we need to know where he's taking them." They got in their car and drove toward the highway, staying far enough behind the two vehicles to avoid detection. The pickup truck and sedan headed east, away from town and toward the foothills where Greenfield's farm was located. But instead of turning toward the farm, the convoy continued past the familiar turnoff, heading deeper into the mountains along increasingly remote roads. "Where are they going?" Margaret asked, checking the map spread across her lap. "Somewhere we can't follow without being spotted," John replied, noting how the road ahead curved through open country with no cover. "We're going to lose them." They watched helplessly as the pickup truck and sedan disappeared around a bend in the road. When John reached the same curve a few minutes later, there was no sign of either vehicle. "There," Margaret said, pointing to a barely visible dirt track that branched off from the main road. "They could have turned there." John pulled over and studied the track through binoculars. Fresh tire marks were visible in the dust, but the path disappeared quickly into dense forest. "That's not a road," he said. "That's a logging trail or fire access route. If they went that way, they're heading somewhere very remote." Margaret pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. "Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Department," the dispatcher answered. "This is Margaret Harper," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "I need to report a possible kidnapping case. 3 children who disappeared 15 years ago. I believe I've found them." Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos arrived at the roadside meeting point 30 minutes later, followed by Detective Ray Coleman from the county's cold case unit. Margaret and John had used the waiting time to organize their evidence: the newspaper clippings, the public records, photographs from the farmer's market, and detailed notes about everything they had observed. "Mrs. Harper," Detective Coleman said, as he approached their car, "I remember your case. I was a patrol officer back in 1981. We searched for those girls for months." "We think we found them," Margaret said, handing him the folder of evidence. 3 young women who call themselves the Strawberry Sisters. They're living with Robert Greenfield, who was their elementary school teacher." Coleman studied the photographs Margaret had discreetly taken at the farmer's market. "The resemblance is striking," he admitted, "but resemblance alone isn't enough for an arrest warrant." "Look at the timeline," John interjected, pointing to their carefully constructed chronology. "Greenfield purchases isolated property 6 months after our daughters disappear. He claims to have adopted 3 orphan sisters, but there's no record of any such adoption. The ages match perfectly." "And the names," Margaret added. "Sarah, Sophie, and Stella. The same names as our daughters. Deputy Santos frowned. That could be coincidence, or it could be psychological manipulation, keeping familiar names to ease the transition. "There's more," Margaret said, and recounted her conversation with Sarah at the farmer's market. She recognized the gardening techniques we taught her. She has the same scar from a childhood accident, and when I asked about memories from before the farm, she became terrified. Detective Coleman closed the folder and looked at both parents. "I have to ask, are you absolutely certain you want to pursue this? If these young women have been living as Greenfield's daughters for 15 years, the psychological trauma of learning the truth could be devastating." "They deserve to know who they really are," Margaret said firmly, "and we deserve to know what happened to our children." "The problem is jurisdiction," Coleman continued. "If they've been taken to another county, or worse, across state lines, this becomes a federal case. The FBI will need to be involved." "Whatever it takes," John said. "We just want them safe." Coleman used his radio to call for backup and notify the FBI field office in San Francisco. Within an hour, they had assembled a small convoy of law enforcement vehicles, including a federal agent named Rebecca Taylor, who had experience with long-term kidnapping cases. "The most important thing," Agent Taylor explained as they briefed the team, "is the safety of the potential victims. If these women have been psychologically conditioned to view Greenfield as their protector and the outside world as a threat, they may not cooperate with a rescue attempt." "What does that mean?" Margaret asked. "It means they might fight us," Taylor replied bluntly. "They might genuinely believe that we're the criminals and that Greenfield is trying to save them from us." The convoy followed the dirt track into the forest, moving slowly to avoid raising dust clouds that might alert Greenfield to their approach. The trail wound deeper into the mountains, past abandoned logging sites and overgrown clear-cuts, until it ended at a gate marked "Private Property, No Trespassing." Beyond the gate, they could see a cluster of buildings in a small valley, a main cabin, several outbuildings, and what appeared to be a large garden. The pickup truck and sedan were parked near the cabin. "Thermal imaging shows 4 people inside the main structure," reported the tactical team leader after scanning the compound with specialized equipment. 3 together in what appears to be the main room, 1 separate in a back room. "Greenfield is keeping them isolated from each other," Agent Taylor observed. "Classic control technique." The team moved into position, surrounding the compound, while a negotiator attempted to make contact using a bullhorn. "Robert Greenfield, this is the FBI. We need to speak with you. Please come out with your hands visible." There was no immediate response from the cabin, but they could see movement through the windows. Then, unexpectedly, the front door opened, and one of the young women emerged. It was Sophie, Margaret realized, recognizing her daughter's cautious way of moving. "Don't come any closer," Sophie called out, her voice shaking. "You're frightening the children." "What children?" Agent Taylor called back. "Us," Sophie replied, and Margaret's heart broke at the genuine terror in her voice. "Our father said you might come someday to take us away from him, but we won't go. We won't leave our home." Agent Taylor lowered the bullhorn and turned to Margaret. She genuinely believes she's a child, even though she's 22 years old. The psychological conditioning is more complete than we anticipated. "Can I try talking to her?" Margaret asked. "As her mother?" "That could be extremely traumatic for both of you," Taylor warned. "More traumatic than leaving her in the hands of her kidnapper?" Margaret shot back. After a brief consultation, Taylor agreed. Margaret approached the cabin slowly, her hands visible, speaking in the gentle voice she had once used for bedtime stories. "Sophie," she called. "Sweetheart, it's me. It's Mom." The young woman on the porch froze, her eyes widening. "You're not my mother," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. "My mother is dead. Dad told us she died in prison." "That's not true, baby," Margaret said, tears streaming down her face. "I'm right here. I've been looking for you for 15 years. I never stopped believing you were alive." "You're lying," Sophie said, but she was staring at Margaret with obvious confusion. You look like You look like the woman in my dreams." "The woman who used to sing to you," Margaret said softly. "The woman with dark hair who knew all the words to Strawberry Fields Forever. That's me, Sophie. That's your real mother." Behind Sophie, the cabin door opened again, and Sarah and Stella emerged, flanking their sister. All three young women stared at Margaret with identical expressions of confused recognition. "It can't be," Stella whispered. "Dad said you were bad people. He said you did terrible things." "The only terrible thing we did was let you play in the front yard," John said, appearing beside Margaret. "We were normal parents who loved you more than anything in the world." "Dad?" Sarah called back toward the cabin. "Dad? What's happening? Who are these people?" Robert Greenfield finally emerged from the cabin, and Margaret saw that 15 years had changed him dramatically. His hair was completely white now, his face deeply lined, and there was something wild in his eyes that suggested a man on the edge of a complete breakdown. "Don't listen to them," he said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. "They're here to take you away from everything we've built together. They want to destroy our family." "We're not your family," Margaret said, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Robert, you know who they really are. You know what you did." "I saved them," Greenfield replied, his voice rising. "I gave them a better life than they ever would have had with you. Look at them. They're strong, healthy, productive members of society. They have skills. They have purpose." "They have no choice," John countered. "They don't know who they really are or where they come from. They can't make real decisions about their lives because you've stolen their identities." "I gave them new identities," Greenfield shot back. "Better identities. Sarah, Sophie, Stella. Tell them how good our life has been together." The three young women looked uncertainly between their father and the people claiming to be their parents. Margaret could see the internal struggle playing out on their faces, 15 years of conditioning warring with deeper, half-remembered truths. "I know this is confusing," Agent Taylor said, stepping forward, "but we can help you sort it out. We have ways to determine the truth: DNA tests, medical records, photographs from when you were children. You don't have to take anyone's word for it." "Photographs?" Stella asked suddenly. "Do you have photographs of us as children?" "Hundreds of them," Margaret said, pulling a worn leather photo wallet from her bag. The edges of the pictures were frayed from years of handling. "Here, this is you on your 6th birthday, all three of you together blowing out candles." She carefully slid the photograph out and held it up. The three young women leaned forward, silence falling, as they studied the faded image of themselves as children. Identical triplets in matching birthday dresses, grinning at the camera, with missing teeth and bright eyes. "I remember that dress," Sophie said softly. "I remember the way the fabric felt." "You fought with your sisters about who got to wear the pink one," Margaret said, hope rising in her voice. "We ended up buying 3 identical pink dresses so there wouldn't be any more arguments." "No," Greenfield said sharply. "Those aren't real memories. You're planting false memories in their minds. Girls, come inside. Now." But the three young women didn't move. They were staring at the photograph, and Margaret could see recognition dawning in their eyes. "The woman who used to sing," Stella said suddenly, looking directly at Margaret. "She had a mole on her neck, right there." She pointed to a small birthmark on Margaret's throat that was barely visible above her shirt collar. "She did," Sarah added, her voice filled with wonder. "And the man? The man used to make pancakes on Sunday mornings. He would let us help flip them." "You always insisted on doing it yourself," John said, his voice thick with emotion. "You'd stand on a chair by the stove, and I'd hold your hands to help you flip them without burning yourself." "Stop," Greenfield commanded, but his voice had lost its authority. "Stop filling their heads with lies." "They're not lies," Sophie said, and for the first time she sounded like an adult rather than a frightened child. "These are my memories, our memories. I remember the house with the blue shutters and the strawberry patch in the backyard." "I remember the swing set," Stella added. And the treehouse Dad built for us. I remember when you took us for ice cream that day, Sarah said, turning to face Greenfield. I remember crying in the car and you telling us that our parents had been hurt and we couldn't go home. Greenfield's face crumpled. I was protecting you, he said. I was giving you a better life. You were stealing our life, Sarah replied, and Margaret had never been prouder of her daughter's strength. You stole 15 years from us. 15 years from our real parents. The confrontation ended quietly, with Greenfield surrendering to federal agents without further resistance. The three young women, no longer the Strawberry Sisters, but Sarah, Sophie, and Stella Harper, were taken to a medical facility for evaluation and counseling. The reunion was not the joyful embrace that Margaret had imagined in her dreams. Instead, it was tentative, awkward, filled with the weight of 15 lost years and the psychological trauma that would take much longer to heal. The young women sat in a conference room at the county mental health facility, looking uncomfortable in the unfamiliar environment. Margaret and John sat across from them, with Dr. Patricia Rosen, a specialist in reunification cases, mediating the conversation. This is going to take time, Dr. Rosen had warned them beforehand. 15 years of psychological conditioning can't be undone overnight. They may experience grief for the life they're losing, even though that life was built on lies. I keep expecting to wake up, Sophie said during one of their first conversations. I keep thinking this is all some kind of dream, and that Mr. Greenfield, will come get us for morning chores. It's normal to feel confused, Dr. Rosen assured her. Your brain has been processing a false reality for most of your conscious life. It's going to take time to integrate your true memories with your recent experiences. Sarah, always the most direct of the three, had questions that cut straight to the heart of the matter. Why didn't you find us sooner? Why did it take 15 years? Margaret struggled with how to answer. We never stopped looking, she said finally. We followed every lead, investigated every tip, never gave up hope. But Mr. Greenfield was very careful to keep you hidden. The farm was isolated, John added. You rarely came to town except for the farmer's market, and even then, he was always watching. It was a perfect prison disguised as a home. It didn't feel like a prison, Stella said quietly. We were happy there most of the time. We had each other. We had work that felt meaningful. He wasn't cruel to us, but he wasn't honest with you either, Dr. Rosen pointed out gently. He denied you the right to know your own history, your own family, your own choices about how to live your lives. The DNA tests, of course, confirmed what everyone already knew. Sarah, Sophie, and Stella were indeed the Harper triplets who had disappeared in 1981. The results were conclusive, but they were also anticlimactic. By then, the young women's memories had already begun returning in fragments. I remember the day we disappeared, Sarah told them during one session. We were playing hopscotch in the front yard when his car pulled up. He called to us, said he wanted to take us for ice cream as a special treat, just a quick trip to the store. We didn't even think to ask Mom for permission because he was our teacher and said it would only take a few minutes, Sophie added. But after we got the ice cream, instead of driving home, he kept driving, Stella continued. Then he pretended to get a phone call and told us there had been an emergency, that our parents had been hurt and were in the hospital. But instead of going to a hospital, he drove us to a motel, Stella continued. He kept us there for several days, telling us that Mom and Dad had died and that we were going to live with him now because we had nowhere else to go. He showed us fake newspaper articles about our deaths, Sarah said. Made us believe that everyone thought we were dead too, so no one would be looking for us. Margaret listened to these revelations with a mixture of relief and horror. Relief that her daughters were alive and speaking, horror at the systematic psychological manipulation they had endured. What about school? John asked. Didn't anyone ever ask about your education, your legal status? He homeschooled us, Sophie explained, taught us reading, writing, basic math, but focused mostly on agricultural skills. said the outside world was dangerous and corrupt, and that we were better off learning practical skills on the farm. We never had birth certificates that we knew about, Stella added. Never went to doctors or dentists unless we were seriously injured. He said the government would take us away from him if they found out about us. The picture that emerged was of a carefully constructed alternate reality, designed to keep three intelligent young women completely dependent on their captor while believing he was their savior. But there were also stories of small kindnesses, of birthday celebrations and holiday traditions that Greenfield had maintained. The situation was more complex than a simple case of imprisonment. It was a form of family life, albeit one built on lies and control. "He did love us in his way," Sarah said during one session, and Margaret felt a stab of jealous pain. It was a twisted, possessive love, but he genuinely believed he was protecting us and giving us a better life. "That doesn't make what he did right," Dr. Rosen said firmly. "Love without truth, love without choice, isn't really love at all." As the weeks passed, the young women began to reclaim their identities piece by piece. They pored over photo albums from their childhood, relearning the faces of relatives they had forgotten, rediscovering interests and personality traits that had been suppressed during their years on the farm. Stella, they discovered, had maintained her love of music despite Greenfield's disapproval of worldly entertainment. Sophie had continued to show the analytical mind that had made her a gifted student, even though she had been denied access to advanced education. Sarah had never lost her nurturing instincts, though they had been channeled into caring for farm animals instead of people. "You're still who you were," Margaret told them during one of their conversations. 15 years couldn't erase your essential selves. They just redirected your energy. The legal proceedings were swift but emotionally draining. Robert Greenfield pled guilty to 3 counts of kidnapping, avoiding a trial that would have required the young women to testify publicly about their experiences. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. "I'm glad we don't have to go through a trial," Sophie said after the sentencing. "I'm not ready to have our story told to the world." "You may never be ready, Doctor," Rosen told them, "and that's okay. You get to decide how much of your experience to share, and with whom." 2 years later, Margaret stood in the backyard of their family home, watching her daughters tend to the strawberry patch they had planted together the previous spring. At 23, Sarah, Sophie, and Stella were still finding their way in a world that felt both familiar and completely foreign. But they were doing it together. The reunion had not been without its challenges. All 3 young women had struggled with depression and anxiety as they processed their experiences. Sophie had required intensive therapy to overcome panic attacks triggered by crowds and unfamiliar environments. Stella had battled insomnia and night terrors. Sarah had developed an eating disorder as she tried to assert control over at least one aspect of her life. But they had also shown remarkable resilience. Sarah was now enrolled in a community college program for sustainable agriculture, channeling her farming knowledge into legitimate academic credentials. Sophie was working part-time at the local library while taking online courses in psychology. She wanted to help other survivors of long-term trauma. Stella was studying music therapy, combining her love of music with a desire to heal others. They lived in the family home now, having moved back in after completing their initial recovery period. The adjustment had been difficult. The house felt both too small and too large, too familiar and completely strange. But gradually, they had made it their own again, filling their childhood rooms with the belongings of the adults they had become. "Mom," Sarah called from the garden, "should we add more compost to the north section?" "Your call," Margaret replied, though the casual use of the word Mom still made her heart skip a beat. It had taken months for the young women to feel comfortable using parental terms, and Margaret treasured each instance. "Do you ever wonder what our lives would have been like if it had never happened?" Stella asked, joining the conversation as she settled cross-legged on the grass. "Every day," Margaret admitted, "but I try not to dwell on it. We can't change the past, but we can shape the future." "I think about it too," Sophie said, looking up from her strawberry plants. "Sometimes I'm angry about the time we lost, but other times I think about the skills we learned, the bond between us that got even stronger. We survived something terrible, and we survived it together." "The therapist says that's called post-traumatic growth," Sarah added, grinning at her sister. "Leave it to Sophie to find the psychological term for everything." They all laughed, and Margaret marveled at how the sound of her daughter's laughter could still bring tears to her eyes. Every ordinary moment felt precious now, every casual conversation a gift that she had never expected to receive. "I have something for you," Margaret said, reaching into her pocket and pulling out 3 small wrapped packages. "I bought these 15 years ago for your 7th birthday. I kept them, thinking, hoping." Sarah, Sophie, and Stella each took a package, unwrapping them carefully to reveal matching silver lockets, each engraved with their initial and birth date. "We were going to give these to you the morning after you disappeared," John explained. "Your mother has been carrying them around ever since, waiting for the right moment." "They're beautiful," Stella said, fastening the chain around her neck. "Perfect." "Just like this moment," Sophie added, reaching out to take her sister's hands. They sat together in the backyard as the sun set over the strawberry patch, 3 young women reclaiming their identities, and 2 parents learning to be a family again. The road ahead was still uncertain, filled with therapy sessions and legal proceedings and the ongoing challenge of healing from trauma. But they were facing it together, and for Margaret Harper, that was more than enough. The strawberries they had planted were beginning to ripen, small red berries that would soon be ready for harvest. Margaret smiled as she watched her daughters planning their first legitimate farmer's market booth, this time selling berries grown from love rather than captivity, offered with joy rather than fear. Some stories, she reflected, do have happy endings. They just take longer to reach than anyone expects. Thanks for watching until the end. It really means a lot. If this story caught your attention, don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to know what stood out to you most. And of course, make sure to subscribe to Seek Stories and hit the bell so you never miss the next mystery. See you soon.